Karen does a lot for She Shares, and she's been an inspiration since the beginning and a founding sponsor, and she has done me the greatest favor today because I don't have to correctly order and pronounce Eleni, but I practice, Tsakopoulos Kounalakis. And we are delighted to have you here today. You know, I think it's especially fitting that we are sitting here on September 11th, and that you are a diplomat for our country, have served as a diplomat. And I want to start by asking you what this day means for you and how you experienced it as an American living abroad.
All right. First of all, just let me say what an incredible honor it is to be here, and thank you everyone behind She Shares for doing these fabulous lunches and bringing us all together. Karen, I will never forget when you first came to Sacramento, and I think everyone knows that she was part of the Clinton administration, and it was so great to see all this talent come to Sacramento and just light it up. And in fact, speaking of the Clintons, I remember one time being in the room when President Clinton came in and he saw you, and he was so overjoyed. He says, "Where are you, Karen? Where are you?" And she says, "I'm in Sacramento, and it's wonderful." So I know that there are great things coming up, I hope, and Karen is going to be back involved. So again, it's just a great privilege to be here, and it is an auspicious day. It's been 13 years since the terrible attacks on our country. And when I was in Hungary, the way that embassies commemorated this day was by rallying people to a day of service, to commit themselves to a day of service. And so for our embassy, we worked with the Hungarian branch of the Red Cross, and we set up a blood drive, which for that country was a very important thing. There are always shortages. So that was our way of contributing and giving back. But of course, this is an important day of remembrance. And you know, where we are right now, I'm sure most of you saw and heard the president's speech last night. You know, we still have tremendous challenges in the world. Many of them grew out of the events of that day. So when you go back to 2001 and you look at the way that the United States is engaged as a response to what happened on September 11th, I think it's clear that there have been actions that we've taken that have been the right actions. Certainly, immediately after the attacks, we called upon our allies and our friends to join us in an appropriate response to eliminate the threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I don't know if you know this, but Article 5 of NATO stipulates that an attack against one is an attack against all. The only time that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked was immediately after September 11th. So the world was with us to take this threat on. And I will also can say unequivocally that our action in Iraq was not the right thing to do. And I want you to know I don't say this from a partisan standpoint, because whether in our country we're pointing fingers between Democrats and a Republican doesn't matter to people around the world. What they are looking at is, what is America doing, whoever our leaders are. And we have to recognize that these are our actions. And it was very challenging during the time that I was in Hungary, as we were working with allies in Europe to build support for our activities in Afghanistan, when after Iraq, to some degree, the United States had fallen off of its white horse. We made the decision to go in without our allies, and the result was not good for us. So what we knew, and the reason many people were against going into Iraq, was that it would set off a chain of events that could lead to terrible sectarian violence. And that is what we're seeing today with the rise of ISIS, or ISIL, as the president uses his terminology. So So it's a day of reflection. It's a serious day. It's a day of service. But it's also a day where we have to ask ourselves as Americans, how are we going to engage in the world in such a way that American power is maintained and effective, because our leadership and our influence in the world is indispensable. This is Madeleine Albright's famous phrase that America is the world's indispensable nation. So I think it's also very much a day of reflection and consideration of moving forward.
Great. I want to ask you, you'll have to forgive me, but I'm many of you know I'm a political junkie and I'm a global world affairs junkie, and so to have the ambassador here is just a thrill. So bear with us. We're going to get to an amazing life story too. But I do want to ask you about another increasingly dangerous corner of the world. And I was struck, there was a poll yesterday that showed that 47% of Americans, nearly half, feel less secure now than they did before 9/11. The level of insecurity we seem to feel in this world is dramatically increasing, and that number is up by like 28% the last time they took that poll a year ago. And they take it, I guess, every year on the eve of 9/11. But you were ambassador to Hungary during the time when your boss, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, had this famous reset button that she gave to her Russian counterpart. And we were going to start all over. And I guess everything was going to be fine. But were you the only person who was not surprised by President Putin's actions in Ukraine? How did you had some interaction with him there in Hungary, and I'm just curious, for your take on what is going on in that part of the world.
So are you going to disclose that you were in Russia with Newsweek when my husband was there
yes,
with NBC
I will,
Neutral News?
Thank you.
And your specific interest in that country?
Yes. You disclosed it, so I don't have to.
That's right. That's right. Well, that's a complicated question. That's a long question. And so let me just start with the question of the reset with Russia. So I have a personal orientation with Russia that is actually partially based on my husband being there and covering the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it actually goes back beyond that. My father is a historian, among every other thing that you might know him for. And he always had a very positive orientation toward Russia that he would tell us about as children. And partially that had to do with the fact that Russia has a history of orthodoxy, which is parallel to Greek Orthodoxy, and partially because when the Ottoman Turks controlled Greece and most of the area around it, during the time of the Ottoman Empire, which lasted in some parts of the world over 600 years, it was the Russians who, largely in their quest for a warm water port, but also because of this notion of the Christian brethren, that was most instrumental in freeing Greece and that region from the Ottoman Empire. So when the reset began, this was something that in our family was seen as a very positive thing, because however you look at Russian history, there are things that bring us together. There are areas of obvious connection and relationship between the American people and the Russian people. It was also, though, from a political standpoint, a time when Medvedev was making the decision of whether or not he was going to run for re-election.
He was then president.
That's correct. And he had served one term because Putin's term had expired. He had term limited out and gone on to serve in the role of prime minister. Medvedev stepped in as the president. And there was this idea then that he should run for re-election. And that was the context of the reset, which is show us the democratic spirit of Russia in showing that there is plurality in your system, and this is not just all about one powerful leader. And that was the context of the reset. So when that, when Medvedev decided not to run and Putin ran again, you know, that unfortunately was, I think, the missed opportunity there. But we still, even under the circumstances today, we still work with Russia. We've still been working with them on non-proliferation goals and on, to some degree, with Iran. But of course, things have deteriorated substantially, and it is a cause for destabilization in the region. When you suggest that maybe I saw it close up, one of the things about where I was in Hungary is that it was a former Soviet satellite country with very deep ties to Russia, but also a very, shall we say, rocky past, because there were Soviet troops stationed in Hungary for the better part of, I don't know, 40 years. So, so we saw this all going down, and we're very, very concerned about it. And now we see where things have landed, that in fact Vladimir Putin did have territorial ambitions and has now advanced those ambitions. And it certainly makes for another trouble spot and a very difficult situation that the United States is doing what we can to engage. The president touched on it a little bit last night. And what I think is important is that there was it was widely viewed as a success of the United States in cooperating with our allies to put sanctions on Iran. That those sanctions, as complicated and difficult as it is to have effective sanctions, economic sanctions on another country, they were quite effective in advancing our goals there. So we've started, again, very difficult to do, a new phase, a new set of sanctions with Russia with the hopes that it will bring them to the table to try to resolve the situation. But, you know, my own view, and this is not the U.S. view,
right.
Well, you know, I'm not speaking for the United States, but Ukraine is a sovereign nation. If Ukraine were a member of NATO, we would be at war.
Absolutely.
So this is very serious, serious business.
Now, you just finished writing a memoir about your time as ambassador, and I want to ask you two questions. First of all, what for you was the best part about representing the United States?
Everything. Everything.
Okay.
It was the honor and the privilege of my life. I can't, waking up every day and seeing the American flag flying outside of my window, and then everything that happened in the day from that point forward. It was just a tremendous honor. You know, we have an odd system. Around the world, diplomats go into their country's foreign service when they're, you know, usually right out of school and rise up to the ranks to become an ambassador. In the United States, depending on, you know, the president, it's usually about 3 out of 4 of American ambassadors become ambassadors that way. They're career foreign service officers that rise through the ranks. And again, a very small percentage of them become ambassadors. And then there's this 1 out of 4. And of the 1 out of 4 that is not a career foreign service officer who becomes an ambassador, there are categories. Very often you see former US senators, former members of Congress who are tapped because they have a particular expertise in that country or in foreign relations. Very often you see experts out of think tanks who are tapped. And then there's this very small category of what I like to call citizen diplomats, where we are literally plucked out of our businesses, plucked out of our communities, and brought in to the State Department, trained, and sent off to become the chief of mission and the top of the chain of command of an embassy around the world. And it is a very steep learning curve. the reason I wrote this book, Karen, was because I knew from the very beginning what an extraordinary privilege this was. And I wanted to bring everyone with me and share this experience. And so that was really the genesis of why I wanted to write it, and that's what I've tried to do.
My other question is, what is the strangest thing that happened while you were ambassador? I don't know if it was a cultural issue, or I know you tried to get your kids into...
This was really strange.
Yeah.
I was having a meeting with the Minister of Interior, and we were talking about cooperation to help with their policing issues with the Roma population. And we were bringing law enforcement trainers in to help them. And I don't know why he said this to me. I mean, maybe because I was a woman, he was trying to kind of bond with me. And all this is through interpreters, okay? So maybe it was because he was trying to make a point about the lack, that the Hungarian people were not by nature terribly violent people. But he said, you know, Madam Ambassador, during the Inquisition, we only burned 7 witches. I think that might have been the strangest moment. Another thing that was strange was that everywhere I went, the Hungarian tradition is something called the csokolom, which translates, I kiss your hand. And so they would take my hand and kiss my hand everywhere I went. But it was so lovely that I don't put it down as the strangest thing, because I liked it so much.
I remember in my reporter days, which we talked about traveling with Secretary Clinton, she was then First Lady, but we visited Eritrea, which had just recently gained independence from Ethiopia. And as we deplaned, singing girls started throwing popcorn at us, which is a welcome sign, and nobody had prepared us for this. And
the old popcorn welcome.
The old popcorn welcome, but it was in everybody's hair, including Mrs. Clinton's and Chelsea's and the press corps, and you know, you want to accept the welcome, and it's meant in a very heartfelt way. But that was one of my interesting overseas moments. So I'm always interested in the strangest. You have succeeded in 2 really male-dominated fields. One is the real estate business, the land development business, and the other is diplomacy. And I'm curious what your experiences in both those worlds has taught you about making your way as a woman in fields where women are not as common.
Well, you know, Nancy Pelosi wrote this great book called Know Your Power. Mm-hmm. And I think it really comes down to that. Women tend to succeed in where you see a lot of women are in places where it's credentialed, you know what the rules are, you fulfill the tasks, and you make your way forward, right? So in academia, for instance, we tend to do quite well. In real estate, you know, for me, my father would tell people, you know, they would come and say, you know, we want to talk to you about this project, and we don't think you're doing the right thing. And I would say, no, this is how we want to do it. And they would say, well, I'm going to go talk to your dad. And my dad would say, don't talk to me, talk to her. Just deal with her, talk to her. And they would have to come back and talk to the little girl, right, in their mind. Because oftentimes when I first started out, it was in my 20s, and these guys were often in their 50s. And so I understood my power because my father stood by me. He gave me authority, and I took it and used it. So what Nancy's point is, when she advises for young women to know your power, is that very often we have it, but we don't use it. We don't know that we have the authority that we do. And so I think that's a big part of it in either case, is you find what your authority is, and then you're not afraid to use it. And I think that's a really big part of the key. The second thing, because I knew you were going to ask me about this, that if I boil down being, having a career and a family and all these things, it's really an enormous part of success really has to do with childcare. I think about how I cobbled together my childcare, and it wasn't just whether or not I could hire someone to come. It's how I felt about where my children were all day when I was working. And, Sophia was enormously helpful when my children were small, not just in looking after them and sending us food when I didn't have time to cook, and buying them their pajamas, running down to Target and bringing Thomas the Tank Engine pajamas for them. But if it's your family, which I really have been very, very blessed with a family that has helped me a lot with my kids and made them feel, even when I wasn't there, that they were loved and that they had love all around them, even when mom was away. And but just as a very, very practical matter, having access to childcare. And so I think that's one thing that is a common thread among all of us, is you go from having a career and feeling like your day is pretty full. How in the world are you going to have kids and make it all work? And it really boils down to that one thing. And so I think advocating in our communities for better childcare is really a key for women, no matter what it is, what industry that you're in. It's a common thread, and it's probably the single most important thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to understand a little bit more about your family life and what you grew up thinking you were going to be.
So I grew up in Sacramento.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Pocket on the river. I have these images of Angela Koufasimas' father driving up with his TV repair truck. I have images of Georgiana Fundis' mother finding me a towel at a swim party when it got cold, and I couldn't find my mom. We had this very close-knit, enveloping church community. It was a Greek American community. It was our church community. And everybody helped each other. And that is probably the strongest kind of memory of growing up. And then, of course, this being out in nature. At the time, there were no houses out in the Pocket. So all the Greeks would come over for hunting days, right? Because this is the best thing ever. You go out, you shoot as many birds as you want, you bring them back. We kids were lined up in a row, given the dove and the pheasant, and we had to pluck all the birds, right? The dads would clean them and the moms would cook them. And so it was really one very close to nature. And then there was also this, very powerful feeling about how important Sacramento was for us, because my father came to Sacramento to go to Sac State, and I think about this often, that when he came to Sacramento to go to college, he didn't know a single person, not one person. And he was so embraced. He was a waiter at the Del Prado, and he would talk to these influential, mostly men, who would come into the restaurant at lunch, who were lobbying at the Capitol, or who were the important business people of the time, who gave them advice. And that really, all through my growing up, this feeling that we owe everything to this community that embraced our immigrant family. And so when I've spent time living all over the world, and I hope to live in other places in the world in my life. But Sacramento is always home to me.
What does it mean to be the child of immigrants? How does that inform your ambition, your approach to life? Well,
I'll tell you, probably since I did just finish writing this memoir, Probably the thing that comes through the most is the connection of our family as active members of civil society. Because when you go to a country that was behind the Iron Curtain, this particular country, Hungary, being behind the Iron Curtain, what you find is that civil society is not very well developed. So we use this term, the State Department uses this term all the time. America uses this term outside of the United States all the time, civil society. And in the United States, we don't even really know what that means, what exactly it refers to, because our civil society is so enormously developed. And the way Hillary Clinton describes it, she says it's the three-legged stool of democracy. You have you have the business sector, private sector, you have government, and then you have civil society, which is everything else. It's basically people organizing and engaging through volunteer work primarily, and nonprofit work, to ensure that government continues to be of the people, by the people, for the people. So She Shares is a great example of a civil society organization. We are so developed in these organizations in the United States, and it is one of the big things that we do, one of the very important things that Hillary Clinton did, was try to pump up civil society and raise its importance and its elevation around the world. When Karen and Donna Lucas and Nancy Miller came to Budapest, I had them speak to a group of businesswomen, prominent businesswomen in Budapest. And I said, I'm not asking you as businesswomen to talk to these businesswomen. I'm asking you as businesswomen who are enormously engaged in philanthropy and as activists to talk to these women. And there was this great moment when Nancy Miller said, the reason I do this, she was talking about one of the issues she was involved in. She said, the reason I do this is because sometimes my government really makes me mad. And you saw these Hungarian women just recoiling at the idea that you would stand up to your government, right? And Nancy represents governments, and she's not afraid to stand up to government. And so this is a very important message. And Hillary would go and meet with presidents and prime ministers and the leaders of local organizations all together. And these people very often couldn't get meetings with their own secretaries of state, but they could meet with the American Secretary of State. They would meet with the incredible, world-renowned Hillary Clinton. And it was her way of saying, look, you are the third leg of this important stool of democracy. You've got to get involved and be active and know your power and know the influence and the role that you play. So going back to your question of being a child of immigrants, a daughter of an immigrant, and watching, my father told me when I was in high school, and I said, well, who were your heroes in your life? And he said, Cesar Chavez. And I said, why? And he said, because I was out picking, and all the other pickers were saying, this guy, Cesar Chavez, is going to get us better conditions, going to make the farmers give us better conditions. And he said, in my mind, I thought, these people are dreaming. Farmers are never going to do that. Just because this one guy, Cesar Chavez, tries to get it, no one's going to listen to him. And when the changes came, he understood that if you organize, if you bring people with you, if you advocate in the United States, you can change the way that government operates. And that was the message that drove him in his life and that he passed along to me and mine.
Oh, you mentioned Hillary Clinton, who you not only served as an ambassador, but she is a friend and someone you've supported. And I think a lot of us in this room are curious for your handicap of the likelihood she might run.
She won in Sacramento.
Yes? Did she?
She won in
so
California.
Did she have the fire in the belly?
So no one can speak for Hillary Clinton except for Hillary Clinton. People ask her husband all the time, and he says, well, you better ask her. But here's what I know about her. She is so committed to our country. She is a policy wonk, and she is, at the same time, a real leader. And she's talked about this recently, the importance of the American story and the American narrative. And for all of us as Americans to reconnect with what our country stands for and what it is we do as we engage around the world. And not just our influence around the world, but how we've always got to lead by example. And how important it is that in this country that we are doing showing that our democracy works. And that is why it is the best form of government, that it starts domestically, but it has implications around the world. So I can tell you this. I really, really hope that she will run for president. And I really hope, and I will tell you, I will do everything I can do. I know Karen and others will also, that if she does decide to run, to see her become president. And for me, this is just so far beyond politics. It's about who we are as a people and being reminded of who we are as a people and being governed in such a way that we can lead by example and continue to lead in the world.
Okay, well, I think we're going to get to your questions in just a minute, but we have a She Shares tradition,
Okay.
the 10 questions, and we're at that point in our conversation.
I didn't get them in advance.
No, you didn't. Nobody does. Let me ask, Eleni, what profession other than your own would you like to attempt? And you have so many professions to choose from.
I'd like to, oh my gosh. I'd like to swim from Alcatraz one day. That's not really on my bucket list.
You can do that. You can do that this Sunday, actually. It's the Escape from Alcatraz. What advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
Well, I would say know your power.
Okay. Name 3 words that best describe you.
Short.
Okay.
Determined and sincere.
Okay.
Try.
If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Oh. Reading people's mind. Sure.
Ooh,
for sure.
We've never had that one. That's a great one.
Sophia can do that, by the way. That's Sophia's superpower. You didn't know. She can also tell if you're having a boy or a girl.
Oh my God.
And whether you're pregnant.
That's it. What book are you currently reading?
I just finished a book of a short biography by Elie Wiesel. It's still on my bedside. I just finished it.
Name one woman, past or present, who has inspired you.
Only one. What was her name? Who was here all the time? Donna, help me out. I'm having a senior moment. Runyon. Jeannie Runyon. She was the first real role model in my life. Yeah.
Great. Okay. People would be surprised to learn what about you?
I almost never wear makeup. Maybe they know just by looking at me.
Okay. And what's your guilty pleasure?
Online Scrabble, all the way.
Okay. Great. So I think we'll open it up now to your questions. Thank you, Eleni, so much. And
Thank you.
Who's got them? Oh, Michelle has the microphone, so if you have a question, please.
Thank you. Madam Ambassador, I am from Hungary, and
Jó reggelt kívánok!
and that's not the only reason I came today. I have a lot of respect for you and your husband, and read his column all the time. I had a question for you about Hungary. By the way, the thing about witches is not the strangest thing.
Of course not. If you're Hungarian, it's absolutely normal.
I can name 3 off the top of my head. Besides the wonderful music and food in Budapest, was there something that really surprised you in a pleasant way about the people and the culture?
So let me just say, my family and I were absolutely, we fell in love with Hungary, with Hungarians, with Hungarian culture, with Budapest. Everyone who came to visit, you know, it is so beautiful and has such an incredibly rich history. But if I had to pick one thing, we loved going to the baths. There are these thermal waters underneath the city, and at the turn of the century, they built these magnificent baths. And what's so great is that you see the strength of what was kind of their upper middle class culture, because they're too big to have just serviced the nobility. This was a product of their boom time in the late 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And they're absolutely magnificent and beautiful. And I would go as often as I could, and I would swim up to Americans and say, hey, I'm the American ambassador. But it's lovely, it's lovely. But I'll tell you, we loved everything about it. We loved the people, we loved the culture. We really miss it. It's been hard. When we were getting ready to go, my boys came home from school. They would take the bus. And they said, Mom, we found a house on the bus route for sale. And we really think we should go look at it. And I said, you know, no, boys, we're not going to go and look at it. And they said, well, just to go look, just to see. And really, no, we're not moving permanently to Budapest. But they could have. We could have stayed there forever. Now, it was challenging, and I write a lot about this in my book. I'm sure you know that the United States took a concerned view over the reform process that the current government went through. When we were there, when I was there in 2010, the elections brought into power the Prime Minister Viktor Orban with a 2/3 supermajority. And in the course of about 18 months, they passed 700 new or amended laws, 700 new or amended laws, and a new constitution. And it was done very, very quickly. Justice Kennedy came to Budapest twice to engage the government and talk about what made an enduring constitution. And at a certain point, Secretary Clinton came and publicly raised concerns about the process and the effect of Hungary's system of checks and balances by the new reforms. So it was also a challenging time for us to be there. But let me tell you, every day I was so grateful to be able to live in that beautiful country.
Thank you. Wanted to also make a warning to the ladies here that men of all ages wear Speedos at those baths.
That's true. That's true.
I don't know who can top that.
I don't know how to follow that. I'm Cassandra Pai. I also visited when the ambassador was in office, and it was an honor and a pleasure. One of the things that struck me actually when I was on my way to the office to meet with you was the statue of Ronald Reagan that was in the village square. And I wonder if you would talk about how the Hungarians viewed all the presidents that you're familiar with, you know, Reagan, Bush, Obama, and then I think lastly, how if you'd speculate on what they might think of a President Clinton, a second President Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let me just say again that most places in the world, people have an opinion about America. Sometimes they'll have an opinion about a particular president, and certainly they did about Ronald Reagan, and I'll mention that. But there's an overwhelming sense when you work in the diplomatic corps that you are representing the United States. You are not there to focus on partisan divides within our country. And the way that we're received is not typically were you appointed by a Democrat or a Republican. It's you're there representing the United States. And so it's very, very important to us, as, you know, in the diplomatic corps, that we rise to that expectation. But there was a very special relationship that the Hungarians had with Ronald Reagan. He was very aggressive when it came to the dismantling of the Soviet Union. And we all know that now, I think. Again, it's beyond partisanship that we know that. And the Hungarians had enough access to outside information that they knew it, that there were powerful countries in Europe even that didn't want to poke Moscow in the eye. And Reagan wasn't afraid to do that. And he would speak about the Hungarians, about the Czechs, about the Poles, and that they deserved, and they deserved to be free, and they needed our support, and they needed us to help. And the Hungarians heard this. And so it was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Ronald Reagan. And former Governor Pete Wilson and Gail Wilson were part of a delegation with Condoleezza Rice and Peggy Noonan and Ed Meese. And they all came to Budapest for the unveiling of this statue in the summer of 2011. And it really was a very, very moving experience. And in fact, the Hungarians gave me the different options for what the statue would look like. And I said, you know, this is you are honoring the former, you know, the president. You should decide, not me. But I kind of like that one. And it's this fabulous image, oversized image of Ronald Reagan taking a long stride. And it's right in front of the embassy. And I could see it outside of my window, and all day long, tourists were coming, and they would, Hungarians, others from former Soviet states, I mean, they really see Ronald Reagan and the Pope as the two people who caused the collapse of the Soviet Union and gained their freedom. And they would come and they would hold his hand and take a picture. It was, you did, Cassandra.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question. So
I'll keep it short. How about that?
Yes.
My sister Athena.
My sister's dreading me asking the
No, I'm not.
Well, I just want to say, obviously, we're all so proud of you, and you're doing an incredible job today talking about it. It's so exciting. I know you love it. It's so exciting because you love it so much, and it's such a part of you. I think the weirdest story is the Boer story.
Okay.
And I think this group would probably really enjoy to hear it. And I also never really got any details of what Angelina Jolie was like, so I think maybe
do tell.
when you hung out with her all day, you know.
Let me take Angelina Jolie first. There's a lot of movie making that goes on in Budapest, and she came to film in the Land of Blood and Honey, which was her first directorial project. And we were invited to go down and to watch her film. You know, she's just an exceptional person. She really is the real deal. She really cares about what's happening in the world and tries to shine a light on these things. You know, to take on the topic of the Balkan Wars and what happened to women during those times, it's happening now. This is one of the tactics that's being used by ISIS. Rape is a very powerful weapon of war, and it was used effectively, and she brought this to light in this very difficult to watch but very effective film. And now, you know, I was listening to some of the commentary after the president's speech last night, and people are talking about this as a top issue of what ISIS is doing. You know, not as a second or third issue, but as a top issue of their tactics for not just causing great pain and suffering, but for demoralizing their enemies by taking their women and abusing their women this way. And one of the things that came out, Marcus was on the John Batchelor show after the thing, and so we were listening to John Batchelor on the radio, and one of the people who was on said, at first they were taking away the women's cell phones, and now they're letting them keep them so that they can broadcast what's happening to them, again, in order for ISIL to be able to, as they want to do, propagandize how they're going to treat their, to again use this as a weapon of war. But she is just a very courageous person, and really, she's the real deal. That's what I can say about her. She's very pretty, too. Okay, so the second question, the boar hunt, and it's a good one to end with. So I told you my father raised us plucking birds, and we all had BB guns and shot targets and shot shotguns. And when I first got to Budapest, my military attaché, defense attaché, Colonel Duggleby, we were bonding, and I told him that I had grown up in this hunting environment, thinking maybe this is the best sort of area of commonality between us. So he tells the chief of defense that I was the hunter. And the chief of defense promptly invited me on a boar hunt in the middle of winter on the Ukraine border with all men, all Hungarian military men, and then Colonel Duggleby, and then my political and economic counselor, who was a former Marine. And we go out, and I said something, my father always gives people an out if they don't want to hunt. So I'll say, well, just, you can shoot with a camera if you don't want to actually shoot a gun. So I said, well, I'll go. And I actually had brought my hunting license with me. I had it, so I brought that along. Nobody checked it. And they gave me this high-powered rifle with a military-grade scope, which I believe came from us. And we went out, and I had a guide and a translator, and the poor translator had been told she's going to be interpreting for the American ambassador, so she was dressed like us today, and had to be kind of wrapped up in blankets as she sat out in the boar stand. And we were out there for a few hours, and I could hear all the shots going. And I thought, I'm going to be the only one who doesn't get a boar, and this is going to be so embarrassing, so humiliating. And so we waited, and the guide said, shh, I think I hear some. So I looked through my scope. It was pretty far away, and I took my shot, and he came right down. Like, okay, great. So I got the boar, and they came out with a Jeep and put it in, hauled it back, and by now it was dark, and everybody else had been back for quite some time. So I go inside, and they're like, oh, it was such a terrible day of hunting. We're so sorry we brought you all this way for nothing. And nobody else had gotten a boar. So Athena wants me to also tell what happened after, and this Hungarian custom, you might know the first time you ever shoot a boar, you have to lay on top of it, and they hit you in the bottom with a switch so that you know some of the boar's pain. Maybe this should have been the answer to the weirdest thing that happened to me. And I thought about that after, and actually chapter 1 of my book is called Boar Hunt, so I'll leave some of the details of that to you. But I'll tell you, the real takeaway though from that was that what happened after is I got in the car, and I was kind of chuffed, that I'd gotten this boar. And so Colonel Duggleby had been a paratrooper, and Paulo Friel was a Marine, as I mentioned. And but you feel chuffed. And so I was saying, well, you know, one time I ran these marathons and I did all these things. So I was kind of feeling like I'd proven something. And then they were sort of relaxed. And so they started telling me their combat stories. And I was so embarrassed that I could think that my, you know, these endeavors that I had had could be anything compared to what they had seen. And no one had, I had never heard combat stories from veterans before, from people in the military before. And it was really a life-changing experience for me. And this element of my service was probably the thing that changed me the most. I went to Afghanistan 2 times, once in 2010, and then again in 2014. I would see American troops, primarily Ohio National Guardsmen, off when they left Budapest, where they'd been training to go into Afghanistan, and I would see them off. And it was the most humbling thing to engage with the US military and to gain a deeper understanding of what they do for our country, and how much gratitude they deserve from us and from those of us who don't serve our country in this way. So, you know, war hunting aside, it really was this life-changing experience to have done it with military men, and it set off this chain of experiences that I had in dealing with the American military. And my book, which this is the first plug for it that I've ever made, it will come out in May, but I dedicate the book to the men and the women of the Foreign Service. And you know, all the way out here in Sacramento, when I was growing up in high school, nobody ever talked to us about joining the Foreign Service. It's one of those things where it's almost a word of mouth, or you hear about it from a professor at school if you're taking foreign policy type classes. But one of my officers was gravely injured in Afghanistan after having served as our consul general, and I write about what happened to him as well. It's dangerous work, and we have, without question, the most capable people doing this work for our country, and the most capable people around the world doing it for the betterment of our friends and allies as well. And they deserve so much gratitude, and one of the other really important reasons that I wrote this was as a tribute to them and to try to raise a little bit of awareness for what they do.
Great.
I have to just say, I think you left one of the best parts of the story out, which is when you tried to get out of it.
I was thinking I would try to get out of the switching by asking Colonel Duggleby to do it for me. But I didn't.
They said they had to hit you with the switch because that's you would feel the pain.
Oh, that's right, to feel the pain of the bore. All right, Athena. Look, I said I have to. I left a lot of details for the book, and I hope that you all will find it and read it when it comes out. And again, thank you so very, very much for inviting me here today. This is the first time I've spoken publicly since I've been back, because I wanted to finish my book before I started. And it's just the most welcoming place to start. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.